Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Tim Sink. I'm president of the Greater Concord Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. We are here for an important announcement with Senator Shaheen, and a little background of our relationship with the senator. She obviously is no stranger to Concord, has served several terms as governor, and as senator has been a tremendous ally to the city of Concord. And a good example of that is her assistance in helping the city secure a federal transportation grant, which really resulted in the redevelopment of downtown Concord, and that would not have happened without that grant. Very competitive grant, so Senator, thank you very much for that support. Thanks. And all you've done for Concord. So we are pleased to host this press conference to discuss the TRACED Act. As we all know, communities, Concord included, are increasingly experiencing this issue that is going far beyond a simple annoyance. Illegal robocalling is a bad reflection on business, so getting a handle on this, I think, is important to the business community. And we are grateful to you for the good work you're doing, and welcome, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for hosting us today. Thank you to the Chamber and to Valerie and everybody who works here for the Chamber. And I'm glad you mentioned the Main Street project, because we were coming through, and I'm sure anybody who tried to drive here today had trouble doing that, but it was nice to see so many people downtown and to see the difference that that project has made. It was a wonderful initiative that included lots of folks, both in the public and private sector. So congratulations to the Chamber for your work, and to the Duprey companies, because they were very much a part of this effort as well. I'm really pleased to be joined this afternoon by Jim Buffetti, who is the Associate Attorney General for the New Hampshire Department of Justice, by Todd Fahey, who's the State Director of AARP New Hampshire, Amanda Noonan, who is the Director of the Consumer Services and External Affairs Division of the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, and Kate Fleming, who is the PR Coordinator for the Duprey companies. And we are here to talk about the onslaught of intrusive and unwanted robocalls that Granite Staters are experiencing. And the numbers are almost so overwhelming it's hard to believe. Last year, Americans received 48 billion, with a B, robocalls. And here in New Hampshire, we received 107 million. So that's a robocall for every man, woman, and child in New Hampshire, more times over. And I would bet everybody in this room has experienced some of those frustrating robocalls. You just get home from work, you go to sit down to dinner, and the phone rings. We have heard from families across the state and from small businesses who are fed up. They want to see something done about it. And that's what we hope the TRACED Act, which has just passed the Senate overwhelmingly, we hope that it will do something about this real challenge that families and small businesses are facing. The other concern, as we look at the upcoming year, is that reports estimate that nearly half of all cell phone calls in this coming year will come from scammers. And what's even more concerning is that these robocalls can also be predatory, and I'm sure that we're going to hear from Todd and Jim about the impact that some of those scams are having on New Hampshire folks, particularly older Granite Staters. Many of these individuals fall victim to deceptive practices where scammers disguise the actual number they're calling from so that the call looks like it's coming from a legitimate or nearby phone number. And so it's no wonder that, given the complexity of this issue, that Americans fall victim to robocall scams. And while there are laws and fines currently in place to prevent these predatory practices, they just aren't cutting it. They're not working in a way that is reducing the number of calls. So what the TRACED Act would do is it would give regulators and service providers the tools they need to crack down on these disruptive robocalls. We also need to ramp up our efforts to protect families and consumers, to alert them to what's happening with deceptive practices, and everyone here is working on that as well. I was pleased to co-sponsor the TRACED Act, and I'm really optimistic that we will be able to get this passed. It is legislation that has passed the Senate, as I said, overwhelmingly. There is similar legislation in the House, and we hope that there will be an agreement between the two bodies in the near future. What this legislation does is give regulators more time to find scammers. It increases civil penalties on those who are caught. It promotes the adoption of call authentication and blocking technologies, and it brings relevant federal agencies and state attorneys general together to evaluate policies and resources needed to better prosecute and deter illegal robocalls. We really need to ensure that small business owners are no longer forced to set aside their daily operations to answer fraudulent calls. We need to ensure that the life-saving work that's conducted at our hospitals and health centers is not interrupted by scam calls. And we need to ensure that consumers are able to maintain trust in our communication system. I think we have started down that road by passing the TRACED Act in the Senate, and hopefully we will soon see action coming out of the House and legislation put in place that will make a difference on this issue. So again, thank you to everyone who's joining us, and let me turn it over to Jim Buffetti and recognize the good work of Jim and our Attorney General McDonald in the work that they have already done to date to try and address robocalls. So thank you, Jim, for joining us.
Thank you, Senator, very much. And thank you for all of the work that you've done in co-sponsoring this piece of legislation. This is significant legislation. This is an incredible step forward in stopping what is probably the most complained about consumer issue that we get at the Attorney General's office. We get a couple of thousand complaints and calls to our consumer hotline every year. And as we know, many of these calls, they're not just an annoyance, but these calls lead to New Hampshire residents losing millions of dollars in scams. This is how they do it. And they are able to, with their technology, they're able to disguise themselves, disguise their phone number, and these calls come in the millions. This technology that has been developed by the scammers is very sophisticated. And the reality is they got ahead of regulators, and they're allowed by a touch of a button to generate millions of calls that come into people, and some of those cause significant harm. At the Department of Justice, the AG, Gordon MacDonald, has been one of the national leaders in bringing together attorneys general to fight this issue. He and the AG in North Carolina started a group of AGs to begin to study this issue with the goal of communicating with these companies, Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, to see what kind of technology they could develop to begin to stop the calls from coming in. This is a difficult issue because oftentimes these scammers are very good at disguising themselves, so it's hard to find them. And it is great that the TRACED Act provides for increased penalties and increased enforcement when you can find them. But we also need to stop the calls from coming in the first place. And what I think is extremely significant in this legislation is that it allows these telecom companies to stop the calls from coming in. They can identify when these scam calls are being generated, and they can stop it. They can also provide tools for consumers to use so they can do effective call blocking of these calls at their residence. I think this is going to make a big difference. It's an issue where I think the scammers will continue to find ways to get around the technology, but I do think that this is a very important step. I'm hoping that this bill does pass and become law. It is something that we really need to address. And again, thank you, Senator, for this work that you're doing. It's going to make a huge difference in the lives of everyone in the state. Thank you.
So we're delighted to have worked on this legislation as well, and we thank the Senator for her fine leadership on this. And as Jim and the Senator have said, this is a big issue in New Hampshire. It's a big issue everywhere. There are about 48 billion robocalls with a B that happen in the United States. And we need to not only equip people to have a good defense, but also to use the technology that's permitting these offenses to occur to stop occurring. So that's one of the things this is doing. We're actually going to redeploy technology to rebut the technology being used to intrude upon the seclusion and the peace of all of us. I mean, it never ends. It seems like these phone calls are incessant. We just did a survey that we fielded in late April, and I just want to give a couple numbers on this. In a little bit of context, the whole robocall system, there is some benefit to it when it's not used for nefarious reasons. And many of these things serve useful purposes. Sometimes if there are school closures or things like weather alerts, but of course the scammers oftentimes get ahead of the technology, and to Jim's point, they get ahead of regulators and they use it to their benefit and to the detriment of many others. We did our survey, and it basically said that our people receive 7 or more robocalls per week. And the survey was a national survey, it hit about 4,000 people, and it was done in conjunction with the University of Chicago. And a majority said they suspect that most of the calls they get are indeed scams. Interestingly enough, most adults use caller ID, and 75% of them know that the information on the caller ID may be fabricated. But they're sometimes inclined to answer if it's from an area code that they're aware of. So here, we're trying to get ahead of that, which is great. People can't rely upon caller ID. What happens here is that we talk about the imposter scams, and there's a lot of them. And the scammers have learned that fear sells. And for them, the sale is the scam. And so instead of convincing somebody to do something, like pay some money in order to get thousands of dollars from a foreign government, the whole idea of making people think they did something wrong is something that happens a lot. So we found that threats are more effective than those scams that try to coerce people into just parting with their money voluntarily. So you might face arrest, or you might be subjected to a lien by the IRS. And so the fact of the matter is people know about these things happening to some degree, but they're not fully aware of them. So we work with people like the Senator's office, we work with the Attorney General's office to try to educate people about the scams. But at the end of the day, the best offense really is a good defense. But we do need this extra addition of technology to help really combat this onslaught of fraud, because it really is a brutal thing. So I would say that this is an excellent, excellent act, and I do hope that the House concurs and they pass something equally as effective. But thank you again for your support.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Senator Shaheen, for inviting the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission to today's event and for your strong leadership on this very important legislation. You've heard some numbers thrown out there. The numbers I'll share are rather small, but if you think about the mission of the Public Utilities Commission, we're really dealing with utility service. So over the past 6 months, the Commission's received close to 200 calls from customers about robocalls. That's in contrast to less than 100 in all of 2018. So there's really a huge spike that we see, and personally, I think we all see on our own phones. Some consumers, like one who just called this week, have reported receiving 4 to 6 to 10 calls every day from robocallers. Other consumers, such as an elderly woman who called this week, report friends and family's information showing up on their caller ID. And this particular elderly woman got a call from herself. It was her name and her number. And she was incredibly concerned that she was the victim of identity theft. She was pretty savvy about caller ID and all that stuff, but she was really afraid that her identity had been stolen. That's really concerning to us, but what's even more concerning are the calls we get from consumers reporting that the caller ID is showing their gas or electric utility company. Over the Memorial Day weekend, I got a similar call on my cell phone. It said it was from Eversource. It was a beautiful sunny day. There were no thunderstorms in the forecast. There was no other event that would prompt Eversource to reach out to its customers about potential power outages. These calls are scam calls, and they're threatening disconnection of utility service if immediate payment isn't made. Those calls tend to target the more vulnerable populations, the elderly and the non-native English speakers. They also target small businesses because for them a loss of utility service equates to lost sales and lost revenues. Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock is the prime time to make those calls to restaurants that can't be without their Friday night sales and their weekend sales. There are apps for your cell phones, there are devices for your landline phones that say they'll block all robocalls. But simply blocking robocalls isn't a solution for consumers. While we as consumers find robocalls a whole number of things annoying, frustrating, harassing, and potentially costly, they do have legitimate and valuable uses. My doctor's office, many other medical practices confirm appointments via a robocalling system. As I mentioned, the electric utilities reach out to their customers in advance of major storms to alert them of the potential for power outages, talk about the steps they should take to prepare for those outages, offer information about where to find shelter if it's a prolonged power outage. Those are all valuable things that none of us want to give up. The TRACE Act would require call authentication for robocalls, equipping telephone providers and their customers with much-needed solutions for screening out fraudulent and misleading phone calls. This legislation will give New Hampshire consumers better information about who's calling them before they decide to answer or not answer the phone. So again, thank you so much for your leadership on this. It's a much-needed step, I think, for New Hampshire consumers. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kate Fleming, and I'm here representing the Duprey companies and Duprey Hospitality. We have 4 hotels here in Concord and a conference center. We pride ourselves on excellent customer service, and most of which happens at our front desk at our hotels. I have spoken with many of our general managers, and they've expressed to me that robocalls are a big distraction and happen multiple times throughout the day. Our staff gets very frustrated with the endless calls, and they feel that the calls pull them away from the guests that are either trying to call in or are actually at the desk who need help. We have one hotel that has 5 deaf employees. The entire staff uses their cell phones throughout the day to communicate with these associates. Those people are also getting constant calling and robocalls on their cell phone throughout the day, but they can't be without them. They need it for work. So not only are they getting it at their front desks, but they're also getting it on their personal cell phones. So in trying to create a positive customer service culture, these distractions and interruptions have a very negative impact on our associates to meet the guests' needs. I also spoke with someone recently that got on a robocall list that called every 10 minutes for 3 days, and when they would block one number, it would switch to another number. So in total, they blocked 5 numbers before it stopped. So we're very much with you on this and appreciate being able to come here and speak on it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kate, and Jim, and Todd, and Amanda, and of course to the Chamber and Tim. Are there any questions that any of the reporters who are here have for any of us? I'm sure that everyone here is happy to answer questions.
Were you saying that with phone, you're advising people not to block because some robocalls are necessary, but rather allow the TRACE Act to allow utilities to block in their own way? Is that what you were trying to say?
Respond to that? Amanda, why don't you come up and...
So I think that's probably a personal decision for customers. Some of the team that works for me at the commission, they put those devices on their phones. I've chosen not to because I do get calls from my doctor's office confirming appointments, and I'm going to forget if they don't call to confirm my appointment. You have to weigh what you want to receive in terms of calls. On a cell phone, it's kind of easy to selectively block those calls. You might have to do it 5 times in a day for 3 days straight to get rid of all those calls. But I think it's really a personal decision. Having the phone companies, though, have the technology that requires authentication and verification of those numbers as being legitimate saves customers from having to potentially miss calls or be harassed by calls.
And that's something the TRACE Act will allow for.
Yes, the TRACE Act will require those telephone companies to make that technology available to consumers. Now, it doesn't go as far as the House bill does and say you have to provide it for free, and the FCC just made a ruling that that technology has to be provided by telephone companies. They also did not go as far as to say it has to be free and charged to consumers, but it must be there so consumers can request it. Any other questions?
Senator, given how much a problem this has become, how much have the telecommunication companies become more active supporters than in the past in efforts to crack down on this?
I can't say from my perspective. I don't know, Jim, maybe, or Todd, maybe you all have seen something from the companies.
Yep. So, as I mentioned, there was this group of attorneys general that their sole mission was to begin to meet with these companies to talk to them about technology and what consumers could get. And I can tell you that they were all very cooperative and very willing to meet with the AGs to talk about what technology may be there. There were some impediments which this legislation actually attempts to overcome. And there are some concerns about if you're too if it's too severe blocking, then there may be calls that people want to come in, they can't come in. But they have done a lot of good work on that. They were very cooperative with us and telling us what is possible. And I think we will see this develop in the next few years in greater ways.
Is there a timetable for when the House may vote and when the two sides might try to come to the table?
There is not. Hopefully it will be soon. And as I said, there are some differences, though we think that those are minor and can be worked out without too much difficulty. But I think the sooner, part of our reason for holding this press conference today is to try and raise awareness that this legislation has passed the Senate, it's pending in the House. We hope people will let their representatives know that this is something that we hope they will push to get this done so it begins to make a difference for people.
It's the TRACE Act. Is that an acronym or is it something?
It is an acronym, and I knew you were going to ask me what it stands for. We will get that to you.
It's all right. I was thinking tracing phone calls is whatever.
It's an acronym.
Okay.
But it works both. It's sort of a pun.
Yeah.
You know, it works both
I'll
ways.
tell you what it is.
Oh, good. You got it.
So, it's the Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act.
That's why we call it TRACED.
So we remember that.
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you to everyone who has participated for everything you're doing now to try and address this problem, and hopefully we'll see the legislation move very quickly and get implemented very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you.